Shalom. This is my first time in Israel, and it is a wonderful feeling to be standing on this stage to speak to you all about typography, about design, about layout, all on the context of the web. Now, what I'm offering is perhaps a perspective that is a little bit different from what you're used to, and I do hope you will hear me out. Now, in case you did not realize, as Bruce introduced, I am Chinese, but I am not from China. For Chinese names, the surname comes first, followed by the given name. So my name is Hui Jing. I used to play basketball full-time, and it was what kickstarted my web career. I also write blog posts from time to time, mostly about CSS. Now, how many people here identify as developers? Lovely. And designers? Nice. So you guys are really great, because I've seen this question asked before, and I realize people in general don't like raising their hands, which is fine. You guys are great, though. And I do want everybody to hold this question in your minds for a little bit. What does the web mean to you? Now, for me, I love the web, the World Wide Web. And I was a lucky kid in that even though our family was far from rich, we've always had a computer in the house because my parents would use it for work. And inevitably, there were games on there. And my first experience with the web sounded something like this. Hope it plays. Now, if you've never heard this before, you can probably guess how old I am. And when I think about the web, I think about how amazing it is that it can connect the world's population. In fact, without the web, it wouldn't be possible for me to be standing here in the beautiful city of Tel Aviv talking to you about the web. Similar to Israel, the country where I'm from does not use English as its first language, although it is used as a second language among many. And of the world's 7.6 billion people, only 4.9% are native English speakers. But 51.2% of websites are in English. There seems to be something wrong with this ratio. Now, I am a fan of Gal Gadot. And I remember watching her at a panel on the San Diego Comic-Con a couple years ago, where an Israeli fan asked her a question in Hebrew. And the first thing she said in response was that she was so moved that someone spoke Hebrew to her. And this really stuck with me. The world is beautiful because of its cultural diversity. Language is a part of a society's cultural heritage and is especially important for the maintenance of it. Now, the web is an informational medium. People go online to find out about things. Even if you're going online to buy something, don't you need to find out information about the product you're going to purchase? So the priority here is always content. The web is only useful to the people who can understand the content on it. Which is why I'm slightly comforted to know that internationalization is a priority at the W3C. It's crucial that a technology meant to be ubiquitous supports the creation of local content, that every writing system in the world can be correctly rendered on the web. Now, someone once asked me this question: do developers even care about typography? I think they do, but maybe I'm wrong. How many of you think typography is important? Wonderful. Now, typography has always been an integral part of human-computer interaction and software design. There's a very good reason why Apple has an entire section dedicated to typography in the Apple Developers Human Interface Guidelines. And you might disagree with me, but as a front-end developer, the code we write impacts how our sites or applications look. And we too have a share of the responsibility of the design of our products. Oliver Reichenstein said this in his article back in 2006, that web design is 95% typography. And he reiterated that the web as a medium is all about information. Now, textual content is the most straightforward method of delivering information on the web. And whether we like it or not, typography is increasingly becoming what differentiates a good website from bad. Let's be honest, people are superficial and have really short attention spans these days. The typography, layout, and design of a site or application are like the clothes we wear, and people make judgments of their first impressions of you or your site based on what they see. Now, there are many definitions of typography out there, and I personally like this one by Garrett Notje, that typography is writing with prefabricated letters. So letters are the building blocks of a writing system, regardless of language. So I want you all to think about the languages that you are familiar with. I'm going to make the assumption that it's Hebrew and English. Now, both these languages are alphabetic. Israel is a world leader in technology and innovation with a robust startup scene. So it is no wonder that Chinese investments in Israeli startups exceeded $500 million in 2015. Earlier this year, Israel and Japan signed 2 agreements in Jerusalem that would increase collaboration in the hopes that it would double trade volume between these 2 countries. So there's a bit of an East Asian relationship developing here. So you can think of this talk as providing a little bit of cultural exchange. Now I'm going to share about an East Asian language that I am very familiar with, which is Chinese. Chinese is not alphabetic. It is a logographic writing system. Each Chinese character is composed within a uniform square, allowing Chinese to be read efficiently, whether it's typeset horizontally or vertically. And until proven otherwise, it seems that the Chinese language was developed separately from the Proto-Sinaitic scripts, which were the origins of alphabetic languages. Which is why the Western languages in Europe are inherently different from the Eastern languages from Asia. Alphabetic languages, which originated from the Phoenician alphabet, combine a small set of letters to form all the words that a language needs for the purpose of communication. Chinese characters, on the other hand, number in the tens of thousands, each a unique glyph that can express meaning on their own or be used in combination with other glyphs. For example, the word hippopotamus. This is an English word. It takes 12 letters to spell. Chinese only needs 2 characters to express the same. Hema. I'm going to butcher this, so excuse me. This is a 13-letter Hebrew word, and in Chinese, we can say bao. Green Hreiferdeurekte. This is a 21-letter Irish word, and again in Chinese, 2 characters will do. Shui. What can I say? Chinese is a concise language. Now, the appearance of the earliest letter forms was directly influenced by the tools that were used to create them. And they continually evolved in tandem with the limitations of the technologies of their time. Take the Latin alphabet, for example, which is derived from Greek. The earliest letters were sans serif when writing was done with a hard-read pen. Now, serifs may have came about due to a transition to a square-cut writing implement like a flat stiff brush. Later scribes and copyists used quill pens, and as demand for written matter grew, they developed more efficient styles of writing, evolving the letter forms yet again. So when it comes to classifying script styles, Latin-based scripts can be broadly put into these 2 big categories of serifs and sans serifs. Chinese characters also changed a lot since their origins. It's just that Chinese writing went through the entire process of development and evolution way earlier than Europe. The key implement in Chinese writing is the brush. Calligraphy was and still is one of the most highly regarded Chinese arts. The works of famous calligraphers were used as the basis for carving woodblocks used for printing. Woodblock printing was invented in China, and the Chinese were exceptional at it, to a point where it was a contributing factor to why movable type, which was also invented in China, never really took off there. These days, typefaces used for printing Chinese publications can broadly be classified into the following families: Songti, Kaiti, Fangsongti, and Heiti. Now, the bottom 2 are 20th century creations, so it's very recent. Now, Chinese typefaces are extremely challenging to create simply due to the volume of glyphs required. The average number of glyphs for a Chinese system font clocks in at around 35,000 glyphs, give or take a few thousand. Typefaces that have enough glyph coverage to be used in body copy are usually made by foundries, because independent type designers usually don't have the bandwidth to do that. So language and writing have allowed human beings to communicate ideas and record history for thousands of years. And we've written on almost anything we could get our hands on. But right now, the medium of our time is the screen and the browser. Our types are now font files, and we've replaced typesetting with composing sticks with CSS. But remember this, an electronic display is a proxy medium. Whatever we see displayed on a screen comes from data encoded as electronic signals. And the heart of electronic displays is light. It is transient. You cannot touch light. The web isn't even 30 yet, and this young medium is nothing like we've seen before. It is dynamic and interactive, and some designers, especially those who are used to having absolute control over their final presentations, may find this behavior disturbing. Although it may be tempting to view the web as simply print expressed on an electronic screen, it is not. It is a unique medium of its own. And when we talk about typography on the web, one of the first things that comes to mind is web fonts. So let's start off with some basics. What is a font? In the world of metal typesetting, this is a font, which refers to the complete set of metal types that were used to typeset entire pages of text. If you can see the really tiny text label, this set being shown is for Caslon, 12-point. In the digital world, these are fonts. Okay, fine, these are font files. And for both analog and digital fonts, you can think of them as collections of glyphs. And what is a glyph? Now, a glyph is a specific shape of a letter or character in a particular font. So this is a glyph, this is a glyph, that's a glyph too. In the digital world, everything is data. So glyphs can be described as an array of pixels or collections of vector images or even paths of Bezier curves and straight lines. Different font formats store information about the font, like their glyphs, their encodings, metadata about the font. All this information is stored differently based on how their specifications were written. It's just data formats, right? And if you've ever used web fonts before, you would have seen this huge list of font formats. And have you ever wondered, why on earth are there so many? Well, we'll need to go a little bit back in history for this. The earliest fonts were pixel-based bitmaps, which is fine, because screens were low resolution at the time, but they also needed to do printing on really high-resolution printers, so a better solution was needed. It was such a worthy problem that smart people came up with two different solutions. So Donald Knuth created Metafont in 1978 for the text system which generated compressed bitmap fonts, while John Warnock, founder of Adobe, came up with PostScript in 1985, the very first vector font, and it really, really took off. So TrueType was Apple and Microsoft's answer to Adobe's font monopoly. Now, both companies then worked separately to improve TrueType, especially with regards to fonts for East Asian writing systems. But eventually, Microsoft actually turned to Adobe, and together they came up with OpenType. EOT, or Embedded OpenType, is Microsoft's proprietary standard, which is a compact form of OpenType meant for use on web pages. Now, even though they tried to submit this as a W3C recommendation, it was rejected in favor of WOF, or Web Open Font Format. Now, WOF2 is an improvement on WOF with significantly better compression rates. So there's that. So on the practical side of things, the font face rule is used to declare a list of different font formats. And we do this in the hopes that our fonts will show up correctly in as many browsers as possible. The number of font formats we need to declare these days has decreased over the years, and right now you can pretty much get away with declaring just WOF and WOF2. Now this is how a font face rule looks like, with all the available descriptors you can declare. Font descriptors and CSS properties are two very different things. Chris Lilly, who chaired the group that developed font face, explained it really well in his .css talk, that properties are requests for styling, and descriptors are descriptions of capabilities. Fun fact, Chris Lilly spoke at last year's You Gotta Love Front End, and you can watch that video on YGLF's YouTube channel. But a font weight bold declared within a font face rule means that this font can do bold, while a font weight bold applied as a property means that please style this element with a font that can do bold. So these here are CSS font properties. And the way I've structured this table is that those I feel are most commonly used are at the top. Now, for a given range of text, these CSS font properties are used by the browser to select a font family and a specific font face within that family to be used when rendering that text. And these, as mentioned earlier, are font descriptors. Now, only the font family descriptor and the source descriptor are mandatory. So if either of them are absent, the entire rule is ignored. The font family descriptor is simply a label that we reference in later CSS declarations. So even if you're using a font like Frutiger, you could actually label it Kreplach, and it would still work. Now, the source descriptor is a comma-separated list of external references or locally installed font face names. And it is made up of the declaration of the font file's location, so the browser knows where to find the font, and an optional font hint. So if the browser doesn't support a particular font format stated in the hint, it won't even bother to go and locate this font. The next three descriptors for weight, stretch, and style are used to match styles to a particular typeface in later CSS declarations. So technically, you could assign a black typeface to a font weight of, say, 100, and proceed to confuse your entire team who cannot figure out why setting a weight of 100 gives them this massively bold typeface. Perhaps an idea for next year's April Fool's Day. Now, my slides use a font called Magnetic Pro, which unfortunately does not support Hebrew characters. So I used a font from the OpenCDU project called Carmelit for the Hebrew characters I needed displayed in the earlier slide. The code points in the Unicode range descriptor are that of the Hebrew letters that I used earlier. Now, say I have a page that uses only English words. Carmelit's font files will not load at all because it is not needed. It will only load when the browser encounters the Hebrew letters in the Unicode range specified. If you work on multilingual sites, it's recommended that you declare your Latin-based font of choice first, because in font stacks, order does matter, especially if you're working with East Asian fonts. Declaring those fonts first will result in the Latin characters being displayed using glyphs from the East Asian font instead. And sometimes the Latin characters in these fonts aren't that polished, and they may not look great, especially on Windows. Another tip is that even though browsers are supposed to match font names case insensitively, it's still recommended to put them in quotes. You never know. Now for the fun stuff. Font feature properties. So these were introduced in fonts level 3, and modern font technologies allow fonts to contain a lot more glyphs than before. So we can utilize a variety of typographic features like swashes, ligatures, old-style numerals, and so on. And perhaps some of you might be wondering, what's the point? What's the point of having all this? Well, they are part and parcel of good typography, which is necessary to hold your reader's attention. Now, the written word is a transference of speech, which is heard, into something visual, which is seen. Good speakers will vary their cadence, they will use gestures, they will emphasize certain words. Typographic features like small caps, correct use of italics and punctuation, they do the same for text. And other features like old-style numerals and ligatures, they help maintain typographic color to make reading more comfortable. So these are the features you can turn on via CSS, but note that the font you're using must have these features to begin with. And this lot up here, these are the features that are most often mentioned at web typography talks. Few people ever talk about font variant East Asian. What this property does is allow for glyph substitution and positioning in East Asian text. If you're unfamiliar with Han characters, it might seem like these languages share the same glyphs, but it depends. Now, Han unification involves assigning the same code point to different glyphs, and it has been quite a controversial issue. We won't get into that, but the point is the same code point can have variant glyphs depending on the language being used, like simplified Chinese glyphs versus traditional Chinese glyphs. Japanese has its own specifications, so they also have alternate glyphs for the same character. So this property allows us to toggle these variant glyphs. Font feature settings allow us to toggle very specific OpenType properties. So last I checked, there were 141 OpenType feature tags to cover things like vertical kerning, unicase, scientific inferiors, and so on. Browser support for each of the font variant properties varies at the moment, with Firefox being the only browser that has supported all of them since 34. Font feature settings, on the other hand, has had quite good support across most browsers. And although the specification recommends to utilize the respective font variant properties, until browser support becomes more robust, I suppose we'll continue to see font feature settings being used instead. Now, within the short span of the web's life, we've seen web layouts evolve as browser technologies and web standards matured. And in the web's infancy, there was no layout whatsoever. I mean, we were still amazed that the web even existed. Then, during the preschool era of the web, we started to use tables to do layout. And that was fun, because like most kindergarteners, everything seemed like a good idea. And there were all sorts of crazy and creative layouts on the web. But then, we got to the preteen era, and things started to conform a little more. We got a bit more self-conscious, a little less radical. It wasn't that cool to be different anymore. So float-based layouts used to build sites with headers, sidebars, footers. These were the most socially acceptable. By high school, life had gotten complicated and angsty. CSS was hard, responsive design, what? People suck, browsers are broken. Oh, someone will do all that for me? Frameworks? Sure, I don't give a crap. So we ended up with websites that utilized very similar layouts. But something big happened this year. CSS Grid was released. Now, CSS Grid is a revolutionary feature that was designed specifically for doing layout on the web. All other technologies we've used in the past, HTML tables, floats, even Flexbox, were never meant to be for use on full page layouts. They were creative hacks that we came up with to build the layouts that we wanted. So this is the year that web layouts come of age. We now have a level of control over how elements are rendered on the browser that we've never had before with CSS Grid. And when used in combination with other properties like CSS shapes, transforms, writing mode, and so on, the design possibilities become endless. Jen Simmons said this in her talk at an event apart a couple years ago, that we need to translate ideas instead of transfer them. And right now, CSS is developed enough for us to take ideas, concepts, and inspiration for layouts from everywhere and translate them onto the web. So vertical writing is traditionally East Asian for Han characters, which are used in Chinese, Japanese, Korean. But when it comes to design, we can lay out text in all directions, if we so choose. So I want to introduce the writing mode property, which deals specifically with vertical text. You literally turn the browser on its side. Now, some people might be saying, no big deal. We can do that with CSS transforms, but it's kind of different. This is what happens to your text when the different values of writing mode are applied, the default being horizontal, top to bottom. To change the direction to vertical, we use vertical RL, right to left, or vertical LR, left to right. And when we rotate text, it's not only the lines that change direction, because each line contains individual letters or characters, and they have an orientation as well. For text orientation, the initial value is mixed. Browsers are smart enough to tell which languages can be typeset both vertically and horizontally, or in one direction only. So Chinese characters, for example, will always be displayed upright, while horizontal-only languages like English and Hebrew, they will have their characters rotated when vertical. So the text orientation property lets us control this and make all the characters upright or sideways if you want to. One more relevant property is text combine upright. This addresses the issue of numerals and abbreviations in vertical text. A common use case you'll see is dates in Taiwan, because they use a calendar called the Mingguo calendar, and this property lets them fit all the digits into this width of one character space and display these digits or letters upright. No browser supports the digits value yet, which is the last one, that allows us to dictate how many digits are acceptable to be placed within this narrow one character space. The range allowed is supposed to be 2 to 4 characters. For now, with the all value, there is no limit. So you could put in a word like hippopotamus, and it would just look horribly squished. It does work, though. Now, laying content in a different direction does require a change in perspective. And I gleaned quite a few insights from working with vertical layout. For example, in the technique I was so used to for centering items worked a bit differently with a vertical layout. See, to vertically center a block like this, setting the top and bottom margins to auto actually does work, unlike in horizontal writing, which is great, but trying to center something horizontally is an exercise in pain. Now, these directions of top, right, bottom, left, they start getting a bit confusing when you have rotated Latin text. So I have a header and some text, right? Say I want some extra spacing between the header and the paragraph. How many people think the margin should be set on the bottom of the header? Great. How many people think it should be set on the left of the header? The correct answer is actually the left, which kind of just doesn't make sense to me. So that's why we have a CSS logical properties specification, which introduces new CSS properties that are flow relative equivalents of the physical box model properties. So they use things like block start and inline start instead of left and right. So this specification is in the thick of working draft status, but I'm eager to see developed and implemented. For now, support is kind of limited. And I built a layout for displaying Chinese text with a toggle that allowed readers to switch between vertical and horizontal layouts. It wasn't as straightforward as I thought it would be. A tricky thing was getting the images to orientate correctly, and I would have loved to have a media query for writing modes, so I could lay out my images accordingly with the picture elements, but that doesn't exist, so I ended up working around this image issue with some hacks using CSS transforms. Still works, though. Now, implementing vertical layouts, admittedly, has become much easier as browser vendors continue to improve the functionality of their products. So this opens up an aspect of graphic design that isn't often seen on the web at the moment. For example, you can make this bookshelf-style list of posts with only CSS. Something like this can be done by applying vertical RL to each list item, plus some padding and inset box shadows for the visual effect. Another idea is maybe for headers. For horizontal languages, you wouldn't lay out long chunks of text vertically because that just makes it hard to read. But using vertical text for short titles or headers can break up the monotony of a really long page. Other subtle uses of vertical text could be for tags on blog posts, where the information is not critical to the main content, so laying it out vertically doesn't adversely affect the reading experience. For languages meant to be read horizontally from top to bottom, vertical text should largely be decorative. We don't want to compromise the reading experience for long-form passages. So at smaller screens, we can make use of media queries to revert to a horizontal layout that makes better use of the limited space. Conversely, there are instances where text rotated vertically can work on narrow screen sizes as well. Perhaps you realized that the hamburger menu was not the best UI pattern we came up with. So depending on the number of links in your navigation, laying them out vertically along the side edge could be a design worth considering. And I'm sure many of you can come up with a lot more interesting designs that utilize vertical layouts. Statistically, there aren't that many sites which use the writing mode property. Now, when I started building vertical layouts, grid hadn't landed yet. So I used Flexbox for a lot of the layout. Now, Flexbox support is excellent. I mean, it has wider coverage than border radius. But Flexbox with writing mode, they don't play so well together. I'll be honest, there are quite a large number of cross-browser bugs, like on Firefox. If you don't specify the width on an element with a vertical writing mode, it just gets kicked off the page. But that doesn't mean we should shy away from using vertical text altogether. In fact, there has never been a better time than now to live on the cutting edge. Evergreen browsers are a thing now, with bug fixes and new features being shipped faster than ever. CSS Grid, I feel, is one of the best rollouts of a new major CSS feature ever, with almost all the major browsers shipping it in March this year. By now, more than 75% of the market is using a browser that supports Grid. And here's a little secret that I discovered. By raising bugs we find when trying out new features, we're actually showing browser vendors that these features are in demand. This works both ways. If we don't use features simply because they are buggy, browser vendors will think that nobody really cares about that feature and choose to fix more pressing bugs instead. But if more of us use these features and raise the bugs that we discover, it sends a signal to the browser vendors that, hey, people are using these features, and encourage them to address related bugs sooner rather than later. So here's a long list of resources I used when preparing this talk, and I'll share these slides for anybody who's interested. If you need inspiration for vertical layouts, the Tateyoko Web Awards site has a really nice list. Now, my friend Jen Simmons also has an experimental layout lab where she showcases all the different things that are now possible with modern CSS. And even if you don't end up using any of what I've covered immediately in your next project, I do hope that you keep these techniques and properties at the back of your mind. And perhaps one day, when you're tired of building the same old layouts again and again, you'll reach for them and create something amazing.